the forgotten Oregon Trail massacre that changed the Wild West. It is the morning of August 20th, 1854, on the dry flats along the Boise River, and a small wagon party has stopped to rest the oxen. There are about 20 of them. Families, mostly, traveling under a man named Alexander Ward. Within the hour, almost every one of them will be dead. 2 boys, both badly wounded, will crawl off into the brush and live to tell what happened. When word of it reaches the settlements, the army marches, and a whole stretch of the Oregon Trail goes silent for years. It becomes one of the most feared stories on the entire route. And yet the thing that actually killed most people who set out on the Oregon Trail looked nothing like this. There were no warriors in it at all. Subscribe and like before we go any further, because the real danger is going to surprise you. Here is the whole of it in 2 lines, so you have it before anything else. This is the forgotten Ward Massacre of 1854, a rare and genuinely brutal attack on the Oregon Trail, and it is the door into a much larger truth, that the trail's real killer was never the ambush the movies are obsessed with. It was disease, and it was water. Let me give you the event itself, and I am going to tell it carefully, because the records here are thin. Alexander Ward was leading a small train, somewhere around 20 people in 5 wagons, moving west through what is now southwestern Idaho. They were close to the old Hudson's Bay trading post called Fort Boise, near where the Boise River runs down to meet the Snake. On that August morning, they were attacked by a band of Boise Shoshone. The fight was short and one-sided. Most of the party was killed on or near the trail. 2 of the Ward boys, both wounded, managed to escape into the country and were found alive. Almost everything else about that day comes to us secondhand, through later reports and the accounts of soldiers who arrived afterward. So the precise number, the exact sequence, the names of everyone in those wagons, all of it sits behind a fog the documents never fully lift. What we can say with confidence is what came next. The killing of the Ward party did not stay a private tragedy. It became a public alarm. The army sent expeditions into the region the following year. Men accused of the attack were pursued, and some were hanged near the site. The old Fort Boise post, already struggling, was abandoned in 1855, worn down by flooding and by the new danger in the country around it. For a few years, emigrants treated that whole stretch as a place to be feared, and some routed around it or waited for escorts. So the attack did exactly what an attack like this does. It terrified a generation of travelers. It put soldiers on the move and reshaped how people thought about the road west. And here is the part that should stop you. It earned all of that fear by being the rare exception. Because what really emptied the wagons on the Oregon Trail, year after year, was something that carried no rifle and rode no horse. Now let me show you the gap between what people feared and what actually came for them. If you had asked an emigrant in the 1850s what frightened them most about the journey, a great many of them would have said the same thing. Attack. The fear, well, was real, it was vivid, and it had been fed for years before they ever loaded a wagon. Newspapers back east printed the worst stories. Guidebooks warned of it. Around the campfires, men told and retold the handful of bloody episodes like the Ward party until those few events felt like the whole shape of the trail. Then, decades later, the movies took that same fear and built an entire genre on it, circled wagons, arrows in the canvas. The lone survivor, it is one of the most repeated images in American storytelling, and it has done something quietly dishonest. It has convinced almost everyone that the great threat on the Oregon Trail came from other human beings with weapons. The records tell a colder and stranger story. The historian John Unruh spent years going through emigrant diaries and counting, as carefully as anyone ever has, who died on these overland trails and how. His estimate, and it is an estimate, is that across the heart of the migration, somewhere around 360 emigrants were killed by Native people, and that emigrants in turn killed a comparable number of Native people, very roughly 400 or so. Put those figures against the size of the migration. Something like 250,000 people walked west on these trails, set a few hundred deaths from attack against 250,000 travelers. And the famous danger shrinks to almost nothing. The thing people feared most was, statistically, one of the least likely ways to die out there. So if it was not the attack, what was it? What actually filled the graves that emigrants passed every single day? The answer was already in their canteens. The #1 killer on the Oregon Trail was invisible, and it traveled in the water. That killer had a name, Cholera. It is a bacterial infection of the gut, and the way it kills is fast and merciless. It empties the body of fluid so quickly that a person who feels fine at breakfast can be dead by dark. Emigrants described exactly that, a man complaining of cramps in the morning, buried by his own family that same evening. Cholera does not need warriors or weapons, it needs only crowds and dirty water. And the Oregon Trail in the peak years gave it both in abundance. Think about how the trail actually worked. Tens of thousands of people moving along the same narrow corridor in the same short season, all drinking from the same rivers and springs, all camping at the same good water, all crossing at the same fords. When one sick traveler fouled the water at a crossing, the next party drank it. The disease moved down the trail like a current, from camp to camp, wagon to wagon. In the worst stretches, especially in the cholera years around 1849 through the early 1850s, the trail became one long burial ground. Diarists wrote of passing fresh graves every few miles, sometimes one after another so close together that they lost count. Some of those graves had to be dug shallow and fast, and emigrants knew it. And they kept walking anyway, because stopping was its own kind of death, and cholera was only the largest piece of it. Then came the water in a different form. The river crossings. The Oregon Trail had to be carried over the Kansas, the Platte, the Green, the Snake, and a dozen lesser rivers, and there were no bridges across most of it. You forded where you could, or you floated the wagons, or you swam the stock through current that was often higher and faster than it looked. People drowned doing this constantly. A wagon would tip in midstream, an ox team would panic, a child would slip from a raft. The Green River and the Snake earned a particular reputation for taking lives. Drowning was not a freak event on this trail. It was an ordinary one. And under all of it ran the daily grind of accidents. This is the part the legend never bothers with, because it is not dramatic, it is just relentless. Wagons were heavy, the ground was rough, and the most common everyday catastrophe was almost absurdly simple. People fell under the wheels, a child riding on the tongue slipped down, a tired adult lost their footing climbing in or out while the train was moving. The wagons did not stop quickly, and a wheel that rolls over a body does not care about courage. Add to that the guns. Loaded firearms carried in jolting wagons went off by accident with terrible regularity, and a man could shoot himself or a companion reaching for a rifle that should have been left unloaded. Add the kicks from animals, the snake bites, the broken bones with no real doctor for hundreds of miles, the lightning on open prairie, the simple bad luck of a body that gives out under months of walking and short rations. Put the whole ledger together and the shape of it is undeniable. Historians estimate that of all the people who died on the Oregon Trail, something on the order of 9 in 10 were killed by disease, by drowning, and by accident. Disease alone, and cholera most of all, accounted for the largest share by far. The arrows and the rifles that fill our imagination accounted for a sliver. The real West did not die in a circled wagon train under attack. It died of bad water, fast rivers, and a wheel in the wrong place at the wrong moment. That is the true face of the trail, and almost no one wants to draw it, because there is no villain in it to point at. Which brings us back to the Ward Party, and to a question worth sitting with. If attacks were so rare, why does this one still echo? Why did a single bloody hour on the Boise River reshape a stretch of the most important migration route in the country? Because rarity is exactly what gave it power. The Ward Massacre mattered far out of proportion to how often anything like it happened, and that disproportion is the whole point. When the news traveled, it confirmed the fear people had carried west all along. It gave a face and a date to the nightmare, and the response matched the fear, not the statistics. The Army sent punitive expeditions into the Boise country. Men were hunted and some were executed. The old fur trading post was given up. The route through the region was effectively shut for a time, and travelers rerouted or held back. One attack, terrible as it was, did all of that. Meanwhile, the cholera that was killing people by the hundreds every season did not close a single fort. It did not send a single expedition. There was nothing to march against, no one to punish, no enemy to name. Disease does not make a war story, so the deaths that actually defined the trail left almost no mark on its reputation. While the deaths that barely registered in the count became the legend, the fear hardened into policy, and the policy hardened into memory. And the memory is what came down to us. We built the danger of the Oregon Trail around its rarest event and quietly forgot the thing that did the real work. So here is the trail, reassembled honestly. It was genuinely deadly. Walking 2,000 miles across a continent in the 1850s was one of the most dangerous things ordinary families ever chose to do, and many of them are still out there, in graves no one can find anymore. But it was not deadly for the reason the legend insists. The Ward party died in a rare and brutal exception, and that exception has crowded out the truth for more than a century and a half. The water in the canteen killed more emigrants than any war party ever did. The river at the ford took more than any ambush. The wheel of your own wagon was more likely to be the end of you than any stranger on a ridge. The Oregon Trail was a graveyard, and almost everyone buried beside it was killed by something you could not shoot back at.